They called him a dinosaur. In 1971, while the rest of Oakhaven County was signing their souls away for shiny green paint and air-conditioned cabs, Andrew Sterling was welding a patch onto a rust-bucket tractor that belonged in a museum. The bankers laughed at him. His neighbors pitied him. They said he didn't understand modern economics. They said you had to spend money to make money. But Andrew knew something they didn't. He knew that debt wasn't a tool, it was a noose waiting for a slip. 10 years later, on a freezing Tuesday in November, those same neighbors stood in the mud, watching the auctioneer sell their family legacies piece by piece. And the only man with a checkbook in his hand was the dinosaur. The fluorescent lights inside the First National Bank of Oakhaven hummed with a sound that reminded Andrew Sterling of a trapped fly. It was a sterile, aggressive buzzing that seemed to drill right into his temples. Andrew sat in the stiff wooden chair, his hat in his hands. His knuckles were swollen, stained permanently with grease and topsoil, a stark contrast to the polished mahogany desk in front of him. Across that desk sat Mr. Henderson, a man whose hands were soft pink and smelled faintly of lavender soap. "It's a simple equation, Andrew," Henderson said, sliding a brochure across the desk. It featured a gleaming international harvester, 915, combine a beast of red metal, tearing through a golden field of wheat. Efficiency, that's the word of the decade. Secretary Butts is telling us to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. You can't do that with your old 58 John Deere. You're leaving bushels in the field. Andrew didn't look at the brochure. He looked at the loan papers Henderson had already prepared. The numbers were upside down, but Andrew could read them. The interest rate was low, temptingly low. But the principal, it was more money than Andrew's father had made in a lifetime. "I've got the cash to overhaul the header on my 55. Andrew said, his voice gravelly and low. "Parts are ordered. I don't need a new machine to cut wheat, Bill. I just need a machine that works." Henderson sighed, leaning back and tenting his fingers. It was a patronizing gesture, the kind a schoolteacher gives a slow child. "Andrew, look. I like you. I liked your dad. But agriculture is changing. It's a business now, not just a lifestyle. Look at Jim Holloway down the road. He just financed 2 of these bad boys and a new grain dryer. He's leveraging his assets to expand. If you don't scale up, you're going to get swallowed up." "Jim Holloway is farming on the bank's land," Andrew replied sharply. "He just doesn't know it yet. He's positioning himself for the future." Henderson's voice rose slightly. "The market is booming. Land values are up 10% this year alone. Your equity is sitting there doing nothing. Let me finance this for you. We can wrap the land note and the equipment note together. 1 payment." Andrew stood up. He was 6'2", built like a fence post, weather-beaten and immovable. He put his hat on, adjusting the brim until it cast a shadow over his eyes. "My daddy taught me that if you can't pay for it with the harvest in the bin, you don't own it," Andrew said. "I won't sign a lien on my grandfather's 300 acres just to sit in air conditioning while I harvest." "You're making a mistake, Andrew," Henderson warned, his smile vanishing. "The world is moving on. You're going to be left behind, in the dust." "Maybe," Andrew said, turning to the glass door. "But it'll be my dust, not yours." Walking out of the bank was like stepping from a freezer into a furnace. The July heat hit him hard, carrying the scent of asphalt and exhaust. Oakhaven was bustling. Pickup trucks, brand new Fords and Chevys lined Main Street. There was a fever in the air, a frantic energy fueled by easy credit and rising commodity prices. Andrew walked down to the Feed Bunk, the local diner where the farmers gathered for coffee and gossip at 10 a.m. sharp. He needed a coffee black to wash the taste of that bank office out of his mouth. As he pushed open the door, The bell jingled and the conversation lulled. At the center table sat Jim Holloway. Jim was 5 years younger than Andrew, loud, boisterous, and currently wearing a brand-new seed cap. He was holding court, gesturing wildly with a half-eaten donut. "I'm telling you boys, the yield monitor on that new 915 is like science fiction," Jim shouted, spotting Andrew. "Hey, Artie, come over here. Tell these fellas I'm not lying. You see me cutting the South 40 yesterday. I finished in 4 hours what used to take me 2 days. Andrew walked to the counter and nodded to the waitress, Sarah. "Just a coffee, Sarah." To go. "Come on, Artie, sit down," Jim persisted. "I heard you were at the bank. Did you finally pull the trigger? Henderson said he had a deal lined up for you." The diner went quiet. Every eye was on Andrew. These were men he had known his whole life. Men he had played football with, men whose barn raisings he had attended. But lately there was a divide. There were the progressives, like Jim, and the holdouts, like Andrew. The holdouts were becoming a minority. "I'm sticking with what I got, Jim," Andrew said, taking the paper cup from Sarah and putting a quarter on the counter. A few chuckles rippled through the room. "Suit yourself," Jim smirked, leaning back. "But don't come crying to me when your old combine throws a rod in the middle of harvest and rain is coming. You're playing with fire, Artie. This is the 1970s. You can't farm like it's 1940 anymore." "I'd rather fix a rod than fix a foreclosure," Andrew said quietly. The room went dead silent. The word foreclosure was taboo. It was a ghost story, something that happened to bad farmers, lazy farmers, not to men with new trucks and rising land values. Jim's face reddened. "Ain't nobody foreclosing on success, Andrew. You're just scared of success." Andrew didn't respond. He turned and walked out the bell, jingling cheerfully behind him. But as he stepped onto the sidewalk, he felt a heavy weight settle in his gut. He wasn't scared of success. He was scared of the sheer, blinding arrogance he saw in everyone's eyes. It felt like the whole town was drunk, and he was the only sober man left to drive the car home. The next 4 years tested Andrew's resolve in ways that broke lesser men. In 1972, the Russian wheat deal happened. The Soviet Union quietly bought up a quarter of the United States wheat crop. Almost overnight, grain prices exploded. Wheat went from $1.32 a bushel to nearly $5. Corn and soy followed suit. It was a gold rush. Suddenly, every farmer in Oak Haven was rich, at least on paper. The cash flow was intoxicating. Men who had scraped by for decades were suddenly buying vacation homes in Florida. The dealership lots were empty because inventory was sold before it even rolled off the truck. Andrew watched it all from the seat of his open station tractor, dust coating his face, the roar of the unmuffled engine deafening him. While Jim Holloway was installing an in-ground pool for his wife, Andrew was lying on his back in the dirt, wrestling with a rusted bearing on his disc harrow. The grease mixed with the sweat on his forehead, stinging his eyes. His knuckles were stripped of skin, raw and bleeding. His wife Martha came out to the shed one sweltering August afternoon in 1974. She was a sturdy woman, pragmatic and sharp, but Andrew could see the fatigue in her eyes. She held a glass of iced tea, the condensation dripping onto her hand. "Here," she said, handing it to him as he slid out from under the machinery. Andrew sat up, wiping his face with a rag that was greasier than his skin. "Thanks. I saw Mary Holloway at the grocer today," Martha said, looking out at the fields. "She was driving a new Cadillac. Said they're taking the kids to Disneyland next week. Flying there." Andrew took a long drink. He didn't say anything. He knew where this was going. "The boys need new shoes for school." "Andrew," Martha added softly. "And the roof on the house. It's leaking in the spare bedroom again." "I'll patch the roof on Sunday," Andrew said. "And we can get the shoes. We have the cash for shoes." "It's not just the shoes, Andrew." Martha's voice cracked slightly. It's everything. Everyone is moving forward. I trust you. I do." "But are we just being stubborn?" Henderson called again. He said land values doubled since '71. He said we're sitting on a gold mine, but living like paupers. Andrew stood up, his joints popping. He walked over to the barn door and looked out at his land. It was good land, black, fertile Iowa soil. He owned it free and clear. No bank had a claim on a single clod of dirt. "Martha, look at Jim's field," Andrew pointed. Across the road, Jim's massive new combine was tearing through the corn, moving at a speed that seemed impossible. "He's moving fast," Martha admitted. "He's moving fast because he has to," Andrew said. "He borrowed money to buy that combine. Then he borrowed against the land to buy the neighbor's plot. Then he borrowed against the crop to pay the interest on the equipment. He has to harvest at record speed or the payments catch him. He's running a race against a tiger, Martha. If he trips, he gets eaten." "But he's not tripping," Martha countered. "He's winning." "For now," Andrew whispered. "It's easy to win when the sun is shining." The isolation was the hardest part. They stopped getting invited to the dinner parties. It wasn't malicious exactly. It was just that Andrew and Martha didn't fit in anymore. They couldn't talk about their new grain bins or their tax shelters. When Andrew went to the feed store, the conversation stopped when he walked in. He became a relic. The crazy old man of Oak Haven, even though he was only 45. Then came the harvest of 1976. It was a wet year. The rains came early in October and didn't stop. The fields turned into gumbo, thick, sticky mud that could swallow a boot whole. Jim Holloway's massive equipment, the pride of the county, became his curse. His new combine weighed 15 tons. The moment he drove it into the field, it sank to the axles. He had four-wheel drive, dual tires, all the bells and whistles, but physics was physics. He was too heavy. Andrew watched from his porch as Jim spent 3 days trying to pull that behemoth out with 2 other tractors. They tore the field to shreds, creating ruts 3 feet deep that would harden like concrete when the freeze came. On the 4th day, the rain let up for a few hours. Andrew walked out to his shed. He fired up his 1958 John Deere 55. It was small. It was light. It didn't have a cab, and it certainly didn't have a radio. He drove it into his field. The small tires stayed on top of the mud. It was slow going, agonizingly slow. He could only cut 4 rows at a time. But he was cutting. Jim Holloway stood by the fence line, covered in mud, watching Andrew work. Jim's $1 million operation was at a standstill, his crop rotting in the husk, because his machines were too big for the conditions. Andrew chugged past the old engine, popping rhythmically. He didn't look at Jim. He didn't gloat. He just kept his eyes on the header, watching the golden corn flow into the hopper. That year, Andrew got his entire crop out before the snow fell. Jim left 30% of his corn in the field to rot over winter. It was a loss, sure. But Jim laughed it off at the diner later that week. "Write-off," Jim bellowed, though his eyes looked a little more tired than usual. "Just a tax write-off, boys. The government pays me not to make money right." Everyone laughed, but Andrew noticed something new in the diner that winter. Mr. Henderson, the banker, wasn't smiling as much. He was looking at his ledger more often. The interest rates, which had been sitting comfortably around 7%, had ticked up to 9%. It was a small crack in the dam, but Andrew heard it. He took the profit from his 1976 crop, hard-earned, muddy profit, and walked into the bank. Not to borrow, but to deposit. He put every cent into a high-yield savings account. "You sure you don't want to reinvest this, Andrew?" Henderson asked, eyeing the check. There's a section of land coming up for auction next month. You could outbid anyone with this down payment. Put it in the savings, Bill, Andrew said, and give me a toaster. I heard you give a free toaster for new accounts. Henderson rolled his eyes. You're missing the boat, Andrew. I like dry land, Andrew replied. Boats tend to sink. Andrew walked out with his free toaster. He didn't know it yet, but the storm of the century was brewing just over the horizon. The 1980s were coming, and the devil was coming to collect on all those signatures. The end of the decade didn't come with a bang. It arrived with a tightening of the chest, a breathless panic that started in the boardrooms of Washington, D.C., and bled slowly, poisonously, into the soil of Oak Haven. By late 1979, the air in the county felt different. It was electric with anxiety. Inflation was running rampant, eating away at every dollar a man earned before he could even spend it. A loaf of bread cost more in the evening than it did in the morning, or at least, that's how it felt. Andrew sat at his kitchen table on a gloomy Saturday in October. The radio was on low and static-filled. Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, had just made an announcement. He was going to break the back of inflation. He was going to stop the money supply. Andrew didn't know much about macroeconomics, but he knew about leverage. He looked across the table at Martha, who was mending a pair of his work trousers. They're raising the prime rate, Andrew said, his voice heavy. Volcker is shutting the valve. What does that mean for us? Martha asked, biting a thread. For us, nothing. We don't owe anybody a dime, Andrew said, staring out the window at the grey sky. But for the neighbours, God help them. The trap hadn't been sprung yet, but the mechanism was armed. Most of the farmers in Oak Haven, including Jim Holloway, had signed loan agreements that contained a specific deadly clause, variable interest rate. When they signed back in 74 and 76, the rate was 7%. The clause was just fine. Print a bunch of lawyer speak that Henderson the banker had waved away with a smile. It just floats with the market, Jim. Standard procedure, nothing to worry about. 2 weeks after Volcker's announcement, the rates began their climb. 11%, 12%, 13%. One afternoon in early 1980, Andrew was at the local co-op buying seed. The mood in the warehouse was usually loud, filled with jokes and the slapping of backs. Today it was like a funeral home. Jim Holloway was there, leaning against a pallet of soybeans. He looked 10 years older than he had just a few months prior. His face was puffy, his eyes rimmed with red, as if he hadn't slept in days. He held a piece of paper in his shaking hand, a notice from the bank. Andrew walked over, hefting a 50-pound bag of seed corn onto his shoulder. He set it down near Jim. Afternoon, Jim. Jim flinched, crumbling the paper into his pocket. Artie. Didn't see you there. Getting ready for planting? Andrew asked. Jim let out a laugh that sounded more like a bark. Planting, yeah, if I can afford the diesel to run the tractors. You see what diesel is trading at? It's criminal, I saw, Andrew said. Jim looked around to make sure no one was listening, then stepped closer to Andrew. The smell of stale whiskey hung on Jim's breath, even though it was barely noon. Hey, Artie, Jim whispered, his voice trembling. Let me ask you something. You read the papers. You think this interest rate hike is temporary. Henderson says it's a blip. Says it'll correct by harvest. Andrew looked Jim in the eye. He saw the desperation there. It was the look of a man treading water in the middle of the ocean, praying for a piece of driftwood. Jim, Andrew said gently. It's not a blip. The government is trying to stop inflation. They're going to keep rates high until the economy cools down. It could be years. Jim's face went pale. Years I can't do years. My operating note. It just adjusted to 16%. 16%, Artie. I'm paying more in interest this month than I made in profit all of last year. Sell the big combine, Andrew advised, his voice low. Sell the new truck. Pay down the principal. Stop the bleeding. Jim recoiled as if Andrew had slapped him. Sell? You want me to sell? And look like a failure? I'm the biggest producer in the county. I can't go back to driving a junker like you. I just need to grow more corn. That's the answer. I'll rent the Willis place. More acres, more volume. I can outrun the interest. You can't outrun compound interest, Jim, Andrew said sadly. It never sleeps. It doesn't get tired. You do. You just don't get it. Jim snapped, his pride flaring up to cover his fear. You've always been small time, Andrew. You don't understand high finance. Jim turned and stormed out of the co-op, leaving Andrew standing in the dust motes, dancing in the light. Then the second hammer dropped. January 4th, 1980. President Jimmy Carter announced an embargo on grain sales to the Soviet Union in response to the invasion of Afghanistan. Overnight, the market for American grain collapsed. The price of corn plummeted. The gold rush of the 1970s was officially dead. Andrew sat on his porch that evening. The phone rang inside the house. It rang for a long time. Finally, Martha answered it. She came to the door a moment later, her face ashen. It was Mary Holloway, she whispered. Andrew turned his head. Is everyone okay? Jim was in the barn, Martha said, clutching her shawl. He was smashing things with a sledgehammer. He destroyed the control panel on that new grain dryer. He was screaming at it. Andrew looked out across the road. The Holloway farm was dark, save for a single light in the machine shed. The equipment didn't fail him, Martha, Andrew said quietly. The dream did. By 1981, the prime interest rate hit 21.5%. It was a number that defied logic. It was usury. It was impossible. For a farmer operating on thin margins, borrowing money at 21% was a death sentence. The landscape of Oak Haven began to change physically. It wasn't just the mood anymore. It was the visual decay. The shiny equipment that had been purchased with such fanfare in 1975 and 1976 began to rust. Farmers couldn't afford the repairs. Tractors sat in fields with blown tires because a replacement tire cost too much. Barns went unpainted. Fences sagged. But the most terrifying change happened inside the First National Bank. Andrew went in one Tuesday to deposit his check from a small sale of hay. The lobby was silent. The tellers kept their heads down, refusing to make eye contact with customers. Mr. Henderson's office door, usually open, was closed. The blinds were drawn. As Andrew stood at the counter, the door to the office cracked open and Tom Willis walked out. Tom was a good man, a third-generation farmer who had followed Jim Holloway's lead and expanded aggressively. Now Tom looked like a ghost. He was weeping. Not sobbing, but a silent, steady stream of tears running down his weathered cheeks. He walked past Andrew without seeing him, clutching a manila envelope to his chest like it was a death certificate. "Can I help you, Mr. Sterling?" the teller asked. Her voice was thin. "What's going on, Sarah?" Andrew asked, nodding toward the door. She leaned in, whispering so quietly Andrew almost couldn't hear her. Headquarters in Des Moines sent down a new team. Asset liquidation. They're forcing Henderson to call the loans, all of them. If the equity ratio drops below a certain point, they foreclose. Immediately. Andrew felt a chill run down his spine. They're calling the notes, "In the middle of the season, land values dropped 30% last month." Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "The collateral isn't worth what they borrowed anymore. The bank is underwater, Mr. Sterling. They're panicking." Andrew deposited his check and walked to Henderson's door. He didn't knock, he just pushed it open. Bill Henderson was sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. An ashtray overflowed with cigarettes. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't look like the arrogant salesman of 1971. He looked like a man who had dug a grave and fallen in. "I can't lend you any money, Andrew," Henderson croaked. "Don't even ask." "I don't need money, Bill," Andrew said, taking a seat. "I want to know how bad it is." Henderson laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "Bad, it's the apocalypse, Andrew. I spent 10 years telling these men to expand. I told them the land would never go down. I sold them the rope." He gestured to a stack of files on his desk. "I have to foreclose on 6 families this week." 6. "I went to high school with 3 of them." "Tom Willis?" Andrew asked. Henderson nodded, staring at the ceiling. "Tom, the Millers, the Davises, and Jim." Andrew froze. "Jim Holloway." "He's underwater, Andrew. Deep. He owes the bank $1.2 million. His land is currently appraised at $600,000. Do the math. He's insolvent." "Does he know?" "He knows," Henderson said. "I sent the letter yesterday. He has 30 days to cure the default, or we auction the equipment and the land." Andrew stood up. He walked to the window of the bank and looked out at Main Street. A for sale sign hung in the window of the hardware store across the street. The town was dying. "Bill," Andrew said, not turning around, "if these farms go to auction, who is going to buy them? No one has any money." "That's the problem," Henderson replied. "The vultures. Corporate investors from Chicago, New York. They're waiting. They'll buy this land for pennies on the dollar. They'll turn us into tenant farmers on our own grandfather's soil." Andrew clenched his fists. The thought of faceless corporations owning Oak Haven made his blood boil. This land wasn't just an asset class. It was blood and bone. "What if—" Andrew started, then paused. He turned to face Henderson. "What if there was a local buyer, someone with cash, someone who wouldn't strip the land?" Henderson looked at Andrew, confused. "Who?" "There's nobody left standing, Andrew. Except—" Henderson stopped. His eyes widened as he looked at Andrew. He looked at the man wearing the same patched overalls he had worn in 1971, the man who drove a 20-year-old truck, the man who had been mocked, ridiculed, and ignored for a decade. "You," Henderson whispered. "You have the cash." "I have the savings," Andrew corrected. "And I have the 1976 harvest money, and the interest you've been paying me for 10 years. "Andrew," Henderson stood up, his hands shaking. "You could buy Jim's note. You could buy the Willis note. But why, you'd be buying a sinking ship." "No," Andrew said firmly. "I'm not buying the debt. I'm buying the land. If it goes to auction, I want to be the one holding the gavel." "You'd be capitalizing on their misery," Henderson said, testing him. "No," Andrew replied, his voice hard as iron. "I'd be keeping the wolves from the East Coast out of Oak Haven. And maybe I can offer these men a way to stay on the dirt, even if they don't own it anymore." Andrew walked out of the bank. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the street. He got into his old truck. It fired up on the first turn of the key. He drove slowly out of town toward the Holloway farm. He didn't know what he was going to say. He just knew that the time for "I told you so" had passed. Now it was time for survival. As he pulled up to his own driveway, he saw a sheriff's cruiser parked across the road at Jim's place. The lights weren't flashing, but the presence was undeniable. Andrew killed the engine and sat in the silence. The drama wasn't in the shouting anymore. It was in the quiet scratching of a pen on a foreclosure notice. The neighbors had played the game of finance and lost. Andrew had played the game of farming and he was the last one left at the table. But winning didn't feel like victory. It felt like a burden, a heavy, terrifying responsibility. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel. They were old hands now. "Time to go to work," he whispered to himself. The day of the auction broke with a sky the color of a bruised plum. A biting wind whipped across the flatlands of Oakhaven, cutting through denim jackets and wool coats alike. It was the kind of cold that settled in the marrow of your bones, making every movement ache. The Holloway farm, once the showpiece of the county, with its manicured lawns and freshly painted fences, now looked like a crime scene. Cars and trucks lined the county road for a mile in either direction. But these weren't just neighbors coming to pay respects. There were unfamiliar cars, black Lincolns and Cadillacs with out-of-state plates, Illinois, New York, Nebraska. Andrew arrived early. He parked his 1965 Chevy truck at the far end of the lane. He walked up the gravel driveway, his boots crunching loudly in the silence. On the lawn, the equipment was arranged in neat rows, like soldiers facing a firing squad. The International Harvester. 915, combined the machine that had started it, all the symbol of the new era, sat closest to the auctioneer's podium. Its red paint was faded, scratched by corn stalks and dulled by the sun. It looked tired. Jim Holloway stood near the barn, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wasn't greeting anyone. He was staring at the ground, kicking at a loose stone. His wife Mary wasn't there. She couldn't bear to watch. The auctioneer, a man named Colonel Baker, who had sold cattle in this county for 30 years, climbed onto the back of a flatbed trailer. He adjusted his microphone. Usually Baker was a showman full of jokes and banter. Today he looked like a priest performing last rites. "All right, folks, let's get started." Baker's voice boomed over the PA system, echoing off the metal siding of the machine shed. "We have a lot to get through. Terms are cash or approved check. No credit." The irony hung in the air like smoke. No credit. The very thing that had built this farm was now forbidden. They started with the small tools, wrenches, welders, air compressors. Andrew watched as men he'd known for decades fought over a box of sockets for $5. It was scavenging. It was desperate. Then came the machinery. The crowd pressed in tighter. Item number 42, International Harvester, 915 combine, turbo diesel, hydrostatic drive, low hours. Baker started his chant, a rhythmic, fast-paced song that usually signaled excitement. "Who'll give me 10,000, I got 5, who'll give me 10 silence." 5,000, Baker pleaded. A hand went up in the back. It was a man in a tan trench coat holding a lit cigarette. He wasn't a farmer. He was a liquidator from Chicago. "I have 5. Who'll give me 6? Jim Holloway flinched. That machine had cost him over $30,000. Sold for $5,000 to buy a number 104. Jim closed his eyes. Andrew stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed. He didn't bid on the equipment. He didn't need it. His old John Deere 55 was sitting in his shed, greased, oiled, and paid for. Finally, at noon, the mood shifted. The crowd grew quiet. The wind seemed to die down. "All right," Baker said, his voice dropping an octave. "Now we move to the real estate. 320 acres of prime Oakhaven soil. Tile drained. High fertility index. We are selling this in one tract." This was it. The blood of the family. Opening bid. Do I hear 2,000 an acre? Silence. 1,500. Silence. The market had collapsed so thoroughly that the numbers didn't make sense anymore. "Give me $800 an acre," Baker said, his voice straining. 800, came a voice. The crowd parted. It was the man in the trench coat again. The suit. He looked bored. He checked his watch. He was buying a lifestyle he didn't understand for the price of a used car. "I have 800, Baker chanted. "Do I hear 850, 850, 850, another voice called out. Another suit, this one, in a blue parka, standing near a black sedan. The two investors began to trade bids, casually, dispassionately. 900, 950, 1,000. They stalled at $1,000 an acre. That was still half of what the land was worth 3 years ago. "I have $1,000 going once," Baker called out. "Going twice." Jim Holloway turned away, his shoulders shaking. He was losing his grandfather's legacy to a tax shelter for a Chicago businessman. 1,500, a deep voice rumbled. The crowd gasped. Heads whipped around. Andrew Sterling stepped forward. He wasn't looking at the auctioneer. He was looking at the man in the tan trench coat. The suit looked annoyed. He scanned Andrew, the faded overalls, the grease-stained cap. He smirked. 1,600, the suit countered. 2,000, Andrew said instantly. The crowd murmured. 2,000 an acre that was above market value. That was irrational. The suit narrowed his eyes. He leaned over to his colleague, whispered something, and shook his head. They had a cap. They were looking for a steal, not a fight. $2,000, the suit asked, raising an eyebrow at the auctioneer. "Does he have the funds?" Colonel Baker looked at Andrew. He knew Andrew. He knew Andrew hadn't bought a new truck in 20 years. "Mr. Sterling is good for it," Baker said firmly. 2,000 going once. Baker yelled, the energy returning to his voice. "Going twice." The suit turned his back and lit another cigarette. "Sold to Andrew Sterling for $2,000 an acre." The gavel came down. It sounded like a gunshot. Jim Holloway looked up, stunned. He stared at Andrew across the sea of heads. Confusion washed over his face. Why would the man he had mocked, the man he had called a dinosaur, pay a premium for his failure? Andrew didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He walked to the clerk's trailer, pulled a checkbook from his bib pocket, and wrote a check for $640,000. As he walked back to his truck, the crowd parted for him with a mixture of awe and fear. He wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was the landlord. 3 years later. The dust had settled, but the landscape of Oak Haven was forever changed. The crisis had washed away nearly half the families in the county. The school was half empty. The diner had closed and reopened as a chain convenience store, but the Sterling operation had grown. It was a crisp morning in April 1985. The sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the fields in hues of violet and gold. Andrew sat in the office he had built in the corner of his machine shed. It wasn't fancy plywood walls, a metal desk, a coffee pot that hissed in the corner. On the wall hung a large map of the county. Pins marked the land he owned. Red pins. There were red pins on the Holloway place, on the Willis place, on the Miller place. In total, Andrew Sterling now controlled nearly 3,000 acres. He wasn't leveraged. He had bought them all the same way, cash on the barrelhead, waiting for the bottom of the market, then striking when the banks were desperate to offload the assets. The door to the shed opened. Andrew swiveled in his chair. "Morning, Jim." Jim Holloway walked in. He was grey now. The boisterous energy of the 1970s was gone, replaced by a quiet, stoic humility. He wore a uniform shirt with a small patch that read, "Sterling Farms." "Morning, boss," Jim said. He held a clipboard. "I checked the planter on the north section. The seed depth is set. We're ready to roll." "How's the ground temp?" Andrew asked, pouring 2 cups of coffee. 55 degrees. Perfect for planting, Jim replied, accepting the cup. Jim Holloway was an employee on the land his great-grandfather had homesteaded. It was a strange arrangement, one that had the town whispering for months. After the auction, Andrew had gone to Jim's rental house. Jim had been expecting an eviction notice, a command to clear out of the county. Instead, Andrew had offered him a job. "I need a manager," Andrew had said. "I can't farm 3,000 acres by myself. You know this land better than anyone, Jim. You know the wet spots, you know the drainage." "You want me to work for you?" Jim had asked, incredulous. "After everything I said to you." "I don't care about what you said," Andrew had replied. "I care about the dirt, and you're a good farmer, Jim. You were just a bad businessman." Now, 3 years later, it worked. Jim managed the day-to-day. He drove the newer tractors. Andrew had finally upgraded the fleet, buying pennies-on-the-dollar equipment from other bankruptcies. "Jim," Andrew said, taking a sip of the black coffee, "I was looking at the books. We're going to have a surplus this year." "That's good news," Jim said, looking at his boots. "I'm setting up a profit-sharing plan," Andrew continued, "for you and for Tom Willis." Jim looked up, his eyes widening. "Profit-sharing?" "You boys do the work," Andrew said, shrugging. "You should see the fruit. I'm also putting a clause in the contract. Buying option. If you want to buy back the homestead house, just the house, and 5 acres, we can set up a payment plan. 0 interest." Jim's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes welled up. To own his home again. To have his name back on the deed. Even if it was just the house, it was a lifeline he never expected. "Andrew," Jim choked out, "why you own it all? You won. You don't have to do this." Andrew stood up and walked to the map. He touched the red pin that marked his own father's land. "I didn't do this to win, Jim," Andrew said softly. "I did it because I saw a storm coming, and I built an ark. But an ark isn't any good if you don't let people on board." He turned back to his neighbor, his employee, his friend. "Besides," Andrew smiled, a rare, crinkled expression that lit up his eyes. "You were right about one thing in 1971. That international harvester, combine, it really does cut wheat faster. I should have bought one sooner." Jim laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the first one in years. Outside, the sun fully broke the horizon, illuminating the vast green ocean of Oakhaven. The tractors roared to life, not the frantic roar of debt-fueled expansion, but the steady, reliable hum of ownership. The neighbors called him a dinosaur. But as Andrew walked out into the morning light, watching his crew prepare the fields, he didn't feel like a relic. He felt like the bedrock. The storm had passed, the floods had receded, and he was the stone that remained. Andrew Sterling died in 1998, leaving behind an estate worth over $20 million. But his legacy wasn't the money. It was the fact that 5 families in Oakhaven are still farming today because he bought them out when the world collapsed and sold it back to them when they could stand on their own feet. The bankers called it inefficient. The economists called it backward. But Andrew knew the truth. In a world drunk on easy money and fast credit, the most revolutionary thing you can be is patient. He proved that while the tortoise might look boring, he's the only one who crosses the finish line while the hare is getting repossessed. If this story hit home for you, if you respect the kind of grit that builds empires out of rust and patience, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It helps us find more people who value these kinds of stories. And if you want to hear more true-to-life tales about the unseen battles of history, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Let me know in the comments, would you have taken the loan in 1971? Or would you have stood your ground? Like Andrew, I'll see you in the next video.